Long before fairies became tiny creatures with glowing wings, people feared them. Their oldest stories were not really about magic, but about the unknown. For centuries, strange things in nature needed an explanation. A sudden illness, a missing animal, or an unexplained sound could become a legend. And somewhere between nature and imagination, the fairy tradition slowly grew. But the word fairy itself is much younger than the beliefs behind it. In medieval Europe, stories about supernatural beings appeared in many different forms. They were not all beautiful, friendly, or even human-looking. Some legends describe beings that could help humans, while others warned against them. That uncertainty made the stories powerful. A fairy was not simply a creature with wings. The older traditions connected supernatural beings with places humans barely understood. Forests, springs, caves, hills, and isolated fields became places of mystery. People gave these places stories, warnings, and invisible inhabitants. Over time, these stories changed whenever they were retold. A mysterious spirit in one village could become a fairy somewhere else, and every generation added something new to the tale. This is why there was never just one ancient fairy tradition. Instead, there were countless local beliefs that slowly influenced one another. And this is where the darker side of fairy folklore begins. Some of the oldest European stories imagine supernatural beings living alongside ordinary people. They were believed to have their own rules, their own places, and their own strange customs. Humans were sometimes welcomed into their world, but rarely without consequences. One common idea was that these beings lived beyond the boundaries of normal human life. The forest was especially important because it was difficult to control or understand. People entered it for wood, food, and hunting, but they never fully knew what waited inside. That uncertainty turned ordinary places into sacred or forbidden spaces. Certain hills and stones became associated with supernatural gatherings. Later, folklore would give some of these places names connected with fairies, but the beliefs were often older than the names people eventually used. This distinction is important when we talk about ancient fairies. The modern image of a tiny winged fairy came much later. Earlier, supernatural beings could be much larger, stranger, and harder to classify. Some were connected to nature, while others were associated with fate, luck, or danger. Their behavior could change from helpful to hostile depending on the story. This made them different from the simple good versus evil creatures of modern fantasy. They could reward respect, punish arrogance, or simply remain mysterious. In many tales, the safest choice was simply to leave them, and that fear of crossing an invisible boundary became one of folklore's strongest themes. Because once you stepped into their world, the old stories warned that the rules could change. One of the strangest ideas in fairy folklore was that time did not always work the same way in their world. A person could enter a mysterious place and return believing only hours had passed, but outside, days, years, or even generations could have gone by. Stories like these appeared in different European traditions, long before modern fantasy created its own rules. The supernatural world was often imagined as close to ours, but separated by an invisible boundary. That boundary could be a forest path, a hill, a doorway, or even a particular hour of the night. Crossing it was never treated as an ordinary journey. In some stories, music and dancing marked the entrance into this hidden world. A traveler might hear beautiful music coming from somewhere no human could see. The temptation was part of the danger. Fairy folklore often warned people not to trust appearances. A beautiful stranger could hide an impossible secret. A friendly invitation could lead someone far from home. And a gift from the supernatural world might carry an unexpected price. These stories were not simply designed to entertain. They also taught people how to behave around dangerous or unfamiliar things. Respect the forest. Respect the places you do not understand. And never assume that the unknown follows human rules. That lesson helped fairy stories survive for generations. But as Christianity spread across Europe, older supernatural beliefs were viewed in a different way. Some ancient spirits were no longer seen as mysterious beings of nature. Instead, They could be described as dangerous, deceptive, or spiritually suspicious. This changed the meaning of many older legends. A spirit once connected with nature could now be treated as something people should fear. Yet the old stories did not disappear. They survived in songs, fireside tales, village traditions, and whispered warnings. Generation after generation carried pieces of the older beliefs forward, and eventually, these traditions began to merge with new ideas. This is when the word fairy began to become more recognizable. But even then, fairies were rarely the harmless creatures we imagine today. They could be unpredictable, proud, generous, or cruel. Their morality was often as complicated as the humans telling their stories. Some legends even described fairy-like beings as guardians of ancient places. Others portrayed them as beings who punished those who broke old customs. That idea made fairy folklore useful as a form of social teaching. The stories taught children what could happen when rules were ignored. They also taught adults to respect boundaries they could not explain, and that may be one reason fairy folklore lasted so long. The stories changed, but the fear of the unknown remained. Centuries later, writers and artists began reshaping these mysterious beings again. The strange spirits of old folklore slowly became characters in literature. Artists gave them recognizable faces, clothing, personalities, and sometimes wings. The tiny winged fairy became one of the most popular versions, but this image was only one chapter in a much older story. The older traditions were far more diverse than the modern picture suggests. Some were guardians, some tricksters, and others simply mysterious neighbors. Their stories reflected the fears and hopes of the people who created them. A good harvest could inspire a generous spirit. A failed harvest could inspire a darker explanation. A dangerous forest could become home to creatures no one dared to name. In this way, fairy folklore became a mirror of human life. It preserved old fears, but also old ideas about nature and community. And perhaps that is why these stories refused to disappear. Every generation changed the fairy slightly, but every generation kept something of the original mystery. Today, fairies are often shown as beautiful, tiny, and harmless, but their ancient roots tell a much stranger story. They were born from humanity's attempt to understand a world that was still full of mysteries. And perhaps the darkest part of fairy folklore is that the unknown was never completely imaginary.